3 days. 3 endless days Margaret had carved her silhouette into the same weathered bench at Millbrook Station. The autumn rain had soaked through her navy wool coat, but she hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't stopped clutching the letter that promised everything and delivered nothing. Meet me at Millbrook Station, Tuesday 4 p.m. I have something important to tell you. The ink had blurred from her desperate fingers, each word now a ghost of hope. Thursday's final whistle pierced the October air. Empty cars rolled past her like her life, full of destinations she'd never reach. The paper slipped from her trembling hands, spiraling down to kiss the puddle-stained concrete. That's when he saw her, the single father with calloused hands and kind eyes, his 8-year-old son tucked safely beside him. Something in her broken posture called to him, demanded he stop, demanded he speak. The words escaped before logic could intervene. "Will you marry me instead?" Margaret's head snapped up. Her grey eyes, rimmed with exhaustion and disappointment, locked onto his face. The stranger stood frozen, his own words hanging in the damp air like smoke from a dying fire. His son Leo tugged at his father's sleeve, confusion creasing his young features. The man's mouth opened, then closed. What had possessed him to say such a thing to a complete stranger? The silence stretched between them, thick as the fog rolling in from the Connecticut hills. The man cleared his throat, his voice rough with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that." His hands found his pockets, seeking refuge from his own impulsiveness. Margaret continued staring, her fingers now empty of the letter that had brought her here. The wind caught the abandoned paper, sending it skittering across the platform like a tumbleweed of broken dreams. She watched it disappear under a bench, then looked back at this unexpected stranger who'd just proposed to her. Leo stepped forward, his small hand reaching out toward Margaret. "Dad, she's been crying." His voice carried that particular honesty only children possess, cutting through adult pretenses like a blade through silk. The boy's observation hung in the air, drawing attention to the tear tracks on Margaret's weathered cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara that made her look even more vulnerable. The man, she still didn't know his name, crouched down to his son's level. "Leo, why don't you go get us some hot chocolate from the vending machine?" He pressed 2 crumpled dollar bills into the boy's palm. "The lady looks cold." Leo nodded solemnly and trotted off toward the machine, his sneakers squeaking against the wet platform. The man straightened and extended his hand toward Margaret. "I'm Ben Carter, and I promise I'm not usually this forward with complete strangers." His smile was sheepish, boyish despite the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and single parenthood. Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of mockery or pity. She found neither. Instead, she saw something she recognized, the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens alone for too long. "Margaret Sullivan," she said, accepting his handshake. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and unshed tears. "And I promise I don't usually look this pathetic." Ben's grip was warm, steady, and he didn't let go immediately. For a moment, neither of them moved, connected by nothing more than skin and circumstance. The vending machine's mechanical whirring filled the silence as Leo fed coins into its slot. Ben finally released Margaret's hand, but remained close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with sawdust, a working man's scent that somehow comforted her. 3 days, he said quietly. "My son noticed you on Tuesday, said there was a sad lady at the station." Margaret's laugh came out as more of a sob. She'd become the local curiosity, the woman who wouldn't leave. How utterly mortifying. "I was supposed to meet someone," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "Someone who apparently had better things to do than keep promises." The bitterness in her tone surprised even her. She'd spent 3 days cycling through hope, disappointment, and anger, but this was the first time she'd allowed the anger to show. Ben nodded as if he understood. Though how could he? He didn't know about the letter, about the 25 years of wondering, about the phone call that had changed everything just to end in another abandonment. Leo returned with 3 steaming cups, struggling to balance them all in his small hands. Ben quickly relieved him of 2, passing one to Margaret. The hot chocolate was thin and overly sweet, probably sitting in that machine for weeks, but it was warm and real, and exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping both hands around the paper cup. The heat seeped through her numb fingers, bringing sensation back to her extremities. She realized she couldn't feel her toes. "Mom used to like hot chocolate," Leo announced, settling onto the bench beside Margaret without invitation. "She put marshmallows in hers, big ones." Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Margaret caught it. The boy continued, unaware of his father's discomfort. "She's in heaven now, with the angels." His matter-of-fact delivery suggested this was a conversation they'd had many times. Margaret felt her heart clench for this little boy, who spoke of loss with such casual acceptance. The rain began falling harder, drumming against the station's metal roof like impatient fingers. Ben glanced at his watch. A simple digital thing, practical rather than fashionable. "Listen, Margaret, you can't stay out here all night. It's supposed to get down to 30 degrees. He hesitated, then forged ahead. "My house is just a few blocks away. You could warm up, maybe get something to eat." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to examine. Margaret knew she should decline. Should thank him politely and call a taxi to take her back to her hotel room. Instead, she found herself nodding. "Just until the rain stops." Ben's relief was visible, though she wondered why her acceptance mattered to him. Leo cheered quietly, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Can we make grilled cheese? And tomato soup?" His enthusiasm was infectious, drawing the first genuine smile Margaret had worn in days. "I think that can be arranged, buddy," Ben said, ruffling his son's hair. The gesture was so natural, so full of easy affection, that Margaret felt a pang of longing she couldn't quite name. They walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook, their footsteps echoing off wet pavement. Margaret noticed how Ben kept himself positioned between her and the street, how he shortened his stride to match hers. Leo chattered constantly, pointing out houses where his friends lived, the park where he played baseball, the library where story time happened on Saturdays. His innocence was a balm to her wounded spirit. This child who saw her not as a strange woman his father had inexplicably invited home, but as a potential friend. Ben's house was a modest colonial, painted white with blue shutters that needed touching up. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, and the garden showed signs of a man too busy to properly maintain it. But warm light glowed from the windows, and Margaret could see children's artwork taped to the glass, stick-figure families and crayon rainbows that spoke of love despite imperfection. "It's not much," Ben said, fishing keys from his pocket. "But it's warm and dry." Margaret thought it looked like a home, something she hadn't had in longer than she cared to remember. Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and something faintly floral. Not perfume, but maybe fabric softener, or the ghost of flowers once kept in vases. Leo immediately began pulling off his shoes and jacket with the efficiency of routine, chattering about homework and soccer practice. Ben helped Margaret with her coat, hanging it carefully on a wooden rack by the door. His hands brushed her shoulders as he lifted the heavy wool, and she felt an unexpected flutter of awareness. When had anyone last touched her with such gentle consideration? The living room was comfortable in the way that homes become when they're actually lived in. Books stacked on end tables, a blanket draped over the couch, sneakers kicked under the coffee table. On the mantel, Margaret noticed a collection of photographs. Leo, at various ages, always with a man who was clearly Ben. But in the earlier photos there was also a woman. Beautiful, dark-haired, laughing. The wife who liked marshmallows in her hot chocolate. Margaret forced herself to look away before she was caught staring. "I'll start the soup," Ben said, already moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Leo, why don't you show Margaret where she can wash up?" The boy nodded importantly and led her down a short hallway lined with more family photos. Margaret tried not to look too closely at the images of the life Ben had built and lost. At the bathroom door, Leo paused and looked up at her with serious eyes that seemed far older than 8 years. "Daddy doesn't usually bring ladies home," he said. "Are you going to stay for a while?" The question was so earnest, so hopeful, that Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I don't know, sweetheart. I'm just visiting for tonight." Leo nodded as if he'd expected that answer, but his disappointment was visible. "That's what they all say," he murmured, then brightened artificially. "But maybe you'll change your mind. The soup's really good, and Daddy tells the best bedtime stories." Before Margaret could respond, he'd skipped away, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the uncomfortable realization that this wasn't the first time Ben had brought a woman home. She studied her reflection in the bathroom mirror, wincing at what she saw. 3 days of waiting had left their mark. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, hair that hung limp with rain and neglect. She looked like exactly what she was, a 62-year-old woman who'd been abandoned at a train station. But as she splashed cold water on her face and finger-combed her hair, she thought about Leo's words. "Are you going to stay for a while?" When was the last time anyone had wanted her to stay anywhere? The kitchen was the heart of the house, clearly the room where real life happened. A round table bore the scars of homework sessions and art projects, and the refrigerator was covered with Leo's school papers and drawings. Ben moved efficiently around the space, opening cans and heating pans with the practiced ease of a man who'd been cooking for himself and his son for some time. He'd rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with small scars that probably came from his work. Margaret found herself wondering what he did for a living, then wondering why she cared. "Can I help with anything?" she asked, though she felt awkward intruding on their established routine. Ben glanced over his shoulder, steam from the heating soup creating a halo around his face. "Just sit and warm up. You look like you need it." There was no judgment in his voice, just simple kindness, and Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. She settled into a chair at the table, Leo immediately claiming the seat beside her. The boy began telling her about his teacher, his best friend Marcus, and the science project on volcanoes that was due next week. As Leo chatted and Ben cooked, Margaret found herself observing the easy rhythm between father and son. The way Ben automatically handed Leo a napkin before he asked for one. How Leo knew without being told to set 3 places at the table. The comfortable silences punctuated by small conversations about mundane things. Homework. Tomorrow's weather. Whether they had enough milk for breakfast. It was so ordinary, so beautifully normal, that Margaret felt tears threatening again. This was what families looked like, she realized. What they sounded like. What they felt like. "Margaret?" Leo's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Are you sad about the person who didn't come meet you?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure wobble. Ben turned from the stove, his face creased with concern, and she realized she was crying again. Not the desperate sobs of earlier, but quiet tears that seemed to come from some deep, hidden place she'd kept locked for years. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I don't usually fall apart in strangers' kitchens." Ben moved to the table, setting down the pot of soup with more care than it required. "You don't have to apologize for being human." His voice was gentle but firm. "And we're not exactly strangers anymore, not after I proposed to you at a train station." The reminder of his inexplicable words made Margaret laugh despite her tears, a watery sound that held more surprise than humor. Leo looked between them with bright curiosity. "You proposed? Like on TV. Did you get down on one knee?" "Leo?" Ben warned, but Margaret was already smiling. "No knee," she said solemnly. "Just 6 very unexpected words." She caught Ben's eye across the table and saw something there that made her pulse quicken. He hadn't explained his outburst, and she hadn't asked, but it hung between them like a secret they weren't ready to share. Leo seemed satisfied with this answer and began ladling soup into bowls with the concentration of a child given an important task. Margaret realized she was hungrier than she'd been in days. They ate in comfortable conversation, Leo regaling them with stories about his classmates, while Ben asked gentle questions that drew Margaret out of her shell. She found herself talking about her work as a librarian, her small apartment in Boston, her love of mystery novels and old movies. Safe topics that revealed nothing of why she'd been waiting at that station, or who had failed to meet her there. Ben didn't push, seeming to understand that some stories needed time to unfold naturally. After dinner, as Ben cleared the table and Leo dragged out homework that needed finishing, Margaret offered to help with dishes. Standing beside Ben at the sink, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they worked, she felt more settled than she had in months. The mundane task of washing and drying dishes became oddly intimate, their movements synchronized like they'd done this dance many times before. When their hands touched reaching for the same plate, neither pulled away immediately, and Margaret wondered if Ben felt it too, this strange sense of rightness, of pieces falling into unexpected places. "Story time," Leo announced from the living room, having finished his math worksheet with impressive speed. Ben glanced at Margaret apologetically. "I usually read to him before bed. You're welcome to." He trailed off, perhaps realizing how presumptuous the invitation might sound. But Margaret was already nodding, drawn by the promise of more of this domestic normalcy she'd never experienced. They settled on the couch, Leo between them, as Ben opened a worn copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. As Ben's voice brought Roald Dahl's words to life, Margaret watched Leo's face go soft with contentment. The boy leaned against her arm without self-consciousness, his small body warm and trusting. Margaret breathed in the scent of his shampoo and felt something maternal stir in her chest, an emotion she'd thought herself too old to experience. When had she last been trusted so completely by another human being? When had anyone needed her presence for something as simple and profound as a bedtime story? Leo fell asleep before Charlie found his golden ticket, his head heavy against Margaret's shoulder. Ben closed the book quietly, his eyes meeting hers over the sleeping child. "He likes you," he whispered, and something in his tone suggested this was significant. He doesn't usually warm up to people so quickly. Margaret smoothed Leo's hair with tentative fingers, marveling at its softness. "He's wonderful," she whispered back. "You've raised him well." The compliment seemed to affect Ben more than she'd expected, his throat working as if swallowing difficult words. They carried Leo to his room together, Ben lifting the sleeping boy while Margaret turned down the covers. The child's bedroom was exactly what she'd expected, a perfect mix of little boy chaos and careful parenting. Toys organized in bins, books lined up on shelves, a desk with crayons arranged by color. On the nightstand, Margaret noticed a framed photo of Leo with the dark-haired woman from the mantel, both of them laughing at some shared joke. Ben tucked his son under the covers with practiced ease, dropping a kiss on the boy's forehead before clicking off the lamp. In the hallway, they stood close in the dim light filtering from the living room. Margaret could hear the soft sounds of Leo's breathing, the tick of a clock somewhere in the house, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Normal sounds of a home at rest. "I should probably go," she said, though she made no move toward the door. "It's getting late." Ben nodded but didn't step aside to let her pass. Instead, he leaned against the wall, studying her face in the shadows. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was barely above a whisper. What were you really waiting for at that station? The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Margaret felt the weight of 25 years of silence, of secrets she'd carried alone for so long they'd become part of her bones. "A second chance," she said finally, the words coming out more truthfully than she'd intended. Ben's eyes didn't leave her face, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see more than she wanted to reveal. "With someone who promised to explain everything and then decided I wasn't worth the effort." The bitterness crept back into her voice, and she hated how raw it sounded. "Their loss," Ben said simply, and the certainty in his voice made something flutter in her chest. "Though I have to admit, I'm glad they didn't show up." The words were out before he could stop them, and Margaret saw surprise flicker across his features as if he hadn't meant to be quite so honest. The air between them suddenly felt charged, full of possibilities neither was prepared to examine. Margaret took a step back, needing space to think clearly. "I should really go," she repeated, but with less conviction than before. Ben straightened from the wall, and for a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, he nodded and led her back to the living room where her coat waited. As he helped her into it, his hands lingered on her shoulders just a moment too long. "Margaret," he said, and something in his tone made her turn to face him. "I know this sounds crazy, but would you like to have coffee tomorrow? With us, I mean. Leo and me." The invitation was casual on the surface, but his eyes held something deeper. "There's a place downtown that makes great pancakes. Leo loves their chocolate chip ones." The offer was simple, innocent, and exactly what she wanted more than she could admit. "I'd like that," she heard herself saying. Ben's smile was brilliant, transforming his face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. 9 o'clock? The Maple Leaf Diner on Main Street? Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling shy as a teenager. At the door, Ben hesitated as if he wanted to say something more, but settled for a simple, "Sleep well, Margaret." She walked back toward town through the quiet streets, her steps lighter than they'd been in days, unaware that Leo was watching from his bedroom window, smiling. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, autumn sunlight streaming through Margaret's hotel room window. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, dreamless and deep, waking with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Standing before the mirror, she took extra care with her appearance, not out of vanity, but from a desire to look like someone worth knowing, someone worth a second glance. The navy dress she'd packed for her mysterious meeting seemed too formal for pancakes with a widowed father and his son, so she chose instead a simple sweater and slacks that flattered her figure without trying too hard. The Maple Leaf Diner was exactly the kind of place Margaret had imagined: red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum, and the comfortable shabbiness that came from decades of serving good food to people who cared more about taste than ambiance. She spotted Ben and Leo immediately, the boy bouncing in his seat as he pointed excitedly at something outside the window. Ben looked up as she approached, his face lighting with genuine pleasure that sent warmth spreading through her chest. "You came," he said, as if he'd been genuinely uncertain. "Of course I came," Margaret replied, sliding into the booth beside Leo, who beamed at her as if she were his favorite person in the world. Over plates of fluffy pancakes and bacon, Margaret learned more about the Carter family. Ben was a carpenter, specializing in furniture restoration, hence the sawdust scent and scarred hands. He'd started the business with his late wife, Sarah, who'd handled the business side while he focused on the craft. Leo was in 3rd grade, played Little League baseball, and wanted to be a paleontologist when he grew up. The boy chatted easily about dinosaurs and fossils while demolishing a stack of chocolate chip pancakes that should have been too much for someone his size. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn into their easy camaraderie as if she'd always belonged there. "What about you?" Ben asked as Leo excused himself to wash syrup from his hands. Do you have family in Boston? The question was natural, conversational, but Margaret felt her comfortable mood falter slightly. Family. Such a simple concept for most people, so complicated for her. Not really, she said, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't need sweetened. I was an only child, and my parents died young. No husband, no children. The words came out matter-of-factly, as if she'd practiced this explanation many times, which she realized she had. But Ben's eyes caught something in her tone, a shadow that suggested the simple answer wasn't the whole truth. That must be lonely, he said gently, and Margaret felt tears threaten again. Why did this man's kindness affect her so strongly? Sometimes, she admitted, but I keep busy. Books are good company. It was a pat answer, the kind she'd given to well-meaning friends and colleagues for years, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't enough anymore. Books didn't warm the other side of the bed, or ask about your day, or need you to kiss their scraped knees better. Leo returned with clean hands and chocolate still smeared on his cheek, which Ben wiped away with practiced efficiency. Margaret, do you want to see my dad's workshop? The boy asked eagerly. He's making a dollhouse for Jenny Martinez's birthday, and it has real tiny furniture and everything. Margaret glanced at Ben, who shrugged. Only if you're interested. I know woodworking isn't everyone's thing. But Margaret found herself nodding, curious about this glimpse into Ben's professional life, the work that put those careful scars on his hands. The workshop occupied a converted garage behind Ben's house, and Margaret was immediately struck by the organized chaos of creativity. Tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboard walls, lumber was stacked by type and size, and the air smelled of wood shavings and varnish. In the center of it all sat the dollhouse Leo had mentioned, a perfect miniature Victorian, complete with gingerbread trim and tiny shingles. Margaret ran her fingers over the detailed work, marveling at the craftsmanship. This is extraordinary, she breathed, and Ben's pleased smile told her the compliment meant something to him. Sarah designed it, he said, pulling out a water-stained sketch from a folder. She was the artist. I just follow her plans. The drawing was detailed and whimsical, clearly the work of someone who understood both children's dreams and architectural reality. Margaret studied the careful notations and measurements, seeing evidence of the partnership Ben had shared with his wife. She had wonderful vision, Margaret said, meaning it. You're bringing it to life beautifully. Ben's throat worked, and she realized she'd touched something raw, a grief still tender despite 3 years of healing. As Ben and Leo showed her around the workshop, Margaret felt herself relaxing into their company in a way that surprised her. Leo peppered her with questions about her favorite books and whether she'd ever met any famous authors. Ben shared stories about particularly challenging restoration projects, his hands moving expressively as he described the process of bringing damaged furniture back to life. Margaret found herself thinking that this was what happiness felt like. This easy conversation, this sense of belonging somewhere, being wanted for no reason other than that she was herself. They walked slowly back to town as afternoon shadows lengthened, Leo skipping ahead to examine interesting rocks, while Ben and Margaret followed at a more sedate pace. Thank you, Margaret said as they paused at the corner where she would turn toward her hotel. For yesterday, for today, for making me feel welcome. Ben stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Margaret, he began, then seemed to struggle with words. I know we barely know each other, but would you consider staying in Millbrook a little longer? There's more I'd like to show you, more we'd like to share with you. The invitation was carefully worded, but Margaret heard the deeper request beneath it. Stay, be part of this. Let us get to know you. Let yourself get to know us. It was everything she'd been hoping for without realizing it, and everything that terrified her. Because staying meant risking attachment, and attachment meant eventual loss, and she wasn't sure her heart could survive another abandonment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have a life in Boston, responsibilities." But even as she said it, she was thinking of her empty apartment, her quiet job, her solitary evenings with only books for company. Leo had circled back to them, listening with the shameless attention of childhood. "Please stay," he said simply. "I like having you around. Dad smiles more when you're here." The observation was delivered with such innocent honesty that both adults fell silent. Margaret glanced at Ben and saw something vulnerable in his expression, as if Leo had revealed more than he'd intended. "It's true," Ben said quietly. "You make us both smile more." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. That night, Margaret lay in her hotel bed staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. She thought about Ben's scarred hands and gentle eyes, about Leo's enthusiastic chatter and unconditional acceptance. She thought about the workshop full of half-finished projects and the kitchen that smelled of home. She thought about the way Ben had said her name, like it mattered, like she mattered. When morning came, she knew what she had to do, though the decision scared her more than she wanted to admit. She found them at the diner again, apparently their regular Saturday breakfast spot. Leo waved her over with syrup-sticky fingers, chattering about his baseball game that afternoon, and would she maybe like to come watch? Ben looked up from his coffee with that smile that made her pulse quicken, and Margaret felt her careful resolve waver. How did you tell people you were falling in love with their life, that you couldn't stay to see where it led? How did you explain that some people were meant to be temporary fixtures in other people's stories? "I've decided to extend my stay," she heard herself saying, and watched Leo's face light up like Christmas morning. Ben's smile was slower, more careful, but no less pleased. "How long?" he asked, and Margaret realized she didn't have an answer. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I suppose we'll see how it goes." It wasn't a commitment exactly, but it wasn't goodbye either. It was something in between, something that felt like possibility wrapped in caution, and for now, it was enough. The baseball game that afternoon became the first of many small adventures. Margaret found herself drawn into the rhythm of Ben and Leo's life. Soccer practices and homework sessions, grocery shopping, and Sunday morning pancakes. She rented a small apartment above the bookstore on Main Street, telling herself it was temporary, even as she unpacked her few belongings with care. Ben helped her move her things, his strong hands gentle with her books and photograph albums, Leo directing the placement of furniture with the authority of an 8-year-old decorator. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret began to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. She learned Leo's schedule by heart, knew which days he had soccer and which nights Ben worked late to finish a particularly complex restoration. She discovered that Ben liked his coffee black but his pancakes drowning in syrup, that he hummed while he worked, that he always checked on Leo twice before going to bed himself. Small intimacies of daily life that felt more precious than grand gestures. But even as she settled into their routine, Margaret carried her secret like a stone in her chest. The real reason she'd been at that station, the letter she'd been waiting for, the truth about who she really was, all of it remained locked away, too dangerous to share. Because how do you tell a man you're falling in love with that you're not who he thinks you are? How do you explain to a child who's grown to trust you that your entire presence in his life is built on a lie? The weight of deception grew heavier with each passing day, even as her feelings for both Ben and Leo deepened beyond anything she'd thought possible. The crisis came, as crises do, when she least expected it. Margaret was helping Leo with a school project about family trees when he casually mentioned that his teacher wanted to meet all the important adults in his life. "I told her about you," he said, carefully gluing construction paper leaves to drawn branches. About how you're like a grandma to me now, and how Dad is happier since you came. The innocent words hit Margaret like physical blows. Grandma, the relationship she'd dreamed of, offered freely by this precious child who had no idea how close to the truth he'd stumbled. That evening, after Leo was in bed, Margaret sat at Ben's kitchen table wrestling with her conscience while he worked on refinishing an antique chair nearby. The comfortable domestic scene that had become her haven now felt like a trap, walls closing in as the weight of her deception became unbearable. "Ben," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you about why I was really at that station." He looked up from his work, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "About who I really am." The story came out in fits and starts. 25 years of regret and loss tumbling from her lips in the lamplight of his kitchen. About Sarah, the daughter she'd driven away in fear and shame. About the letter that had arrived too late, 3 years too late. About the grandson she'd never known existed until a lawyer's phone call 6 months ago had changed everything. Ben listened without interruption, his face growing paler with each revelation, and Margaret watched their fragile new relationship crumble with every word she spoke. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a chasm too wide to cross. Ben's hands were motionless on the chair he'd been sanding, his knuckles white with tension. "You're Leo's grandmother," he said finally, his voice flat with shock. "Sarah's mother, the one she said was dead." The words hit Margaret like accusations, which she supposed they were. "She thought I was dead because I let her believe it," Margaret whispered. "Because I was 17 and terrified and made the worst mistake of my life." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Years of anger and grief poured out of Ben, rage at Margaret's deception, fury at Sarah's pain, devastation at the realization that the woman he'd begun to love had built their relationship on lies. Margaret absorbed it all, knowing she deserved every harsh word, every accusation of betrayal. When Ben finally ran out of words, they sat in the wreckage of what might have been, both breathing hard from the emotional storm. "I should go," Margaret said finally, though the words felt like tearing pieces from her heart. "You're right to be angry. I should never have deceived you." But as she started to rise, Ben's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, and something in his tone made her sink back into her chair. They looked at each other across the table, this man she'd grown to love, and the truth that stood between them like a wall. "Sarah wrote about her childhood sometimes," Ben said slowly. "About feeling abandoned, about wondering if her mother ever thought about her." The conversation that followed was quieter, more painful in its gentleness than the anger had been. Ben spoke of Sarah's nightmares, her fear of abandonment that had colored their entire marriage. Margaret shared her own nightmares, the decades of wondering and regret that had shaped her solitary life. Slowly, carefully, they began to build understanding from the ruins of their trust. It wasn't forgiveness, that would take time, but it was a beginning, a foundation on which something new might eventually be built. Leo found them the next morning still talking at the kitchen table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the debris of 2 lives laid bare. The boy took one look at their faces and seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. "Are you fighting?" he asked Margaret, his voice small and worried. "Are you going away?" The questions cut straight to the heart of Margaret's fear, that her revelation would cost her not just Ben's love, but Leo's trust as well. Margaret knelt to Leo's eye level, taking his small hands in hers. "I'm your grandmother," she said simply, knowing that the truth, however difficult, was what this child deserved. "Your mummy was my daughter, and I made some very bad choices a long time ago that kept us apart. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." Leo processed this information with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. So you're like a real grandma? Not just a pretend one? When Margaret nodded, his face broke into a smile that made her heart soar and break simultaneously. Cool. I never had a real grandma before. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding. Ben needed time to process his feelings, anger, betrayal, but also relief that Leo finally had family beyond just him. Margaret moved back to her hotel, giving them space while they figured out what their new relationship would look like. Some days were better than others. Some conversations ended in tears or silence. But slowly, carefully, they began to find their way toward something that felt like forgiveness, like family, like the second chance Margaret had been waiting for without knowing it. The proposal, when it finally came, happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in November. Margaret was reading to Leo while Ben finished dinner dishes, the domestic routine they'd rebuilt from the ashes of deception. Leo had fallen asleep against her shoulder, as he often did during story time, and Ben had come to carry him to bed. As they stood together in the hallway afterward, he took her hand. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I have something to ask you." But instead of the words she expected, he surprised her. "I know this is complicated. I know we have a lot to work through still. But Leo needs his grandmother, and I need you too. Not as Sarah's replacement, but as yourself. As Margaret." He paused, searching for the right words. "What I'm asking is, would you consider making this permanent? All of it. The three of us. As a family." It wasn't the romantic proposal of fairy tales, but it was something better, an offering of real life, with all its complications and possibilities. Margaret looked at this man who'd seen her at her most broken and still chose to love her, at the sleeping child who'd accepted her truth with the generous heart of innocence, at the life they'd built together from the pieces of their separate losses. "Yes," she said simply, and felt the last of her carefully guarded walls crumble. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Ben's smile was brilliant, transforming his face with joy, and when he kissed her it tasted like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen, their kitchen, watching Leo attempt to flip pancakes with more enthusiasm than skill, while Ben hovered nearby, ready to rescue breakfast from disaster. The morning light streamed through windows she'd hung curtains in, illuminating a space that had become theirs through the slow accumulation of shared moments. Her books mingled with Leo's toys on the shelves. Her coffee mug sat beside Ben's in the cabinet. Her life had found its place in theirs, as naturally as a river finding the sea. They'd married quietly in the spring, with Leo as ring-bearer and half the town as witnesses, because Millbrook had adopted Margaret as one of their own. The ceremony had been simple, but the vows were not. Promises built on truth this time, on full knowledge of each other's flaws and histories. Margaret had worn Sarah's pearls with Ben's blessing, carrying his first wife's memory with them into their new beginning. It felt right somehow, this continuation rather than replacement, this expansion of love rather than substitution. As Leo finally managed to successfully flip a pancake, cheering at his achievement, Margaret felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what family felt like. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but real and lasting, and worth every moment of pain it had taken to find it. Ben caught her eye across the kitchen and smiled, that same smile that had made her pulse quicken in a train station cafe months ago, and she knew with absolute certainty that some second chances were worth waiting a lifetime for. The letter that had brought her to Millbrook Station still existed, tucked away in a drawer with other mementos of her old life. But she rarely looked at it anymore. Instead, she focused on the life she was writing now, not with someone from her past, but with the family she'd found in the most unexpected place. Sometimes the best proposals weren't planned or perfect. Sometimes they came from strangers at train stations who saw your pain and offered their hearts instead. Sometimes the greatest love stories began with 6 impossible words. Will you marry me instead?